Well, hello, and welcome back to the Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we journey chapter by chapter through C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. This is chapter 13 of The Last Battle, How the Dwarfs Refuse to be Taken In.
And we have a special guest.
We do. We are joined today by the Reverend Andrew Lazo, a name that some of our listeners might be familiar with. But just for as a little reminder for us here, Father Andrew Lazo is an internationally known speaker and writer specializing in C.S. Lewis and the Inklings. He holds a B.A. with honors from UC Davis, an M.A. in modernist British literature from Rice University, and an M.Div. with honors from Virginia Theological Seminary. He's a frequent speaker around the U.S. and the U.K. and has written quite a few articles on C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. Back in 2009, Andrew published Mere Christians, Inspiring Encounters with C.S. Lewis, and 5 years after that, he transcribed, edited, and published a previously unknown book by C.S. Lewis, Early Prose Joy, which was Lewis's very first spiritual autobiography. Just earlier this year, Andrew was ordained as a priest in the Episcopal Church, and in January of 2023, and he serves as the apprentice rector at Church of the Messiah in Winter Garden, Florida. He's also pursuing his doctorate in Romantic Theology at Northwind Seminary, where he serves as a distinguished lecturer. Andrew is the glad husband of best-selling author and speaker, Dr. Kristen Ditchfield Lazo. And for nearly 20 years, Andrew has been working on a long-awaited study of Till We Have Faces, making groundbreaking discoveries all along the way. Andrew, welcome to the Lamppost Listener.
Hey, fellas. It's so great to finally sit down and chat with you. I would be remiss in not noting that we're connected through David Bates and the Pints with Jack podcast. And I've been a co-host there. We're starting season 7, and that's my 4th season with them. And it's been a joy to enter the world of podcasting, which came at their invite. And I'm glad that brought us into the same circle.
Thanks for mentioning that, Andrew. I think that it's so, everyone, David and Matt and your work is just so popular and widely known that you're right. I assume that just everyone already knows those great things about you as well, too. But
well, they should.
But it is, obviously, you all have been doing some great work over on Pints with Jack. You joined them back for the Screw Tape Letters. That was when you came on as a full-time host, and it's been wonderful once you came aboard and just I brought a new voice to that show. We love Matt and David. We've been listening to them since they started right before, a little before we did, and You've been a great addition to that community as well.
Well, it's been fun to find friends, even though I've only been in the same room with David a couple of times and just met Matt for the first time.
Yeah.
But that Philly was there from the start. Interesting enough to folks who are interested in Narnia, we're starting season 7, in which we'll look at Letters to an American Lady, but we'll also dip into Letters to Children. Mm-hmm. And he writes a lot about the Narnia process, and lots of things in that. So I'm looking forward to what we dive into this year.
Yes, and on top of that, I just realized we can lord over Matt Bush's head the fact that we met you in person before he ever did.
That's right.
Earlier this year, we got to meet you.
The day after I got ordained.
That's right. It's been a very busy year for you.
It's been okay. Yeah, and I'm off to Romania to speak at Lewis Conference in a couple of weeks, and it sounds very glamorous, but it's just whenever I get a chance to speak on Lewis, I'm paying a long-standing debt for all the good that he's done in my life.
That's wonderful. That's great. Well, yeah. We are going to talk today about Chapter 13, but before we dive into that, I'd like to just ask you a few questions, some of which I think many of our listeners will be intrigued by, and some of which I think will actually prepare us for the conversation we're going to have on Chapter 13. But can you just let us know, Andrew, how did you first encounter C.S. Lewis? You speak of him as if he has done so many important things for your life, but how did that relationship first begin?
Yeah, well, I'm shocked to have become an Episcopal priest, and that was the likely path when I started out. For the first 14 years of my life, I wasn't a believer, wasn't raised with believers. But I was a voracious reader, and I had a wonderful aunt who kept those fires stoked, kept that hunger fed. And one year, one of the things she sent us was that great, cheapy paperback copies of the Narnia Chronicles, and just fell in love with the stories, fell in love with Peter and his nobility, but just loved they were rollicking good tales. I ripped right through them and read them again and again. After coming to faith in high school through the witness of friends in a public high school, they literally showed me the love of God, and I was like, hey, what is that? And they told me, and I said, well, I'll give some of that a try, and we'll see how that works out. Well, you can see it's a very dangerous thing to set your foot upon the path, says Bilbo. And so I reread Narnia in high school, and I thought I felt very proud of myself because I discovered, and this might be news to you, so hang on. I discovered there's Christianity in the Chronicles of Narnia. Do I need to pause? Shall I pause for a moment for you to gasp?
Yeah, just let that sink in.
Man, we're going to have to re-record all these seasons. We have not thought about that.
Yeah,
we'll go back and start at the beginning again.
I had someone come up to me as I was reading it and say that they were reading it too, and then I followed up a couple of weeks later and they said, no, I'm not reading it anymore. I found out the whole thing is they use the terminology, but there were a lot of problems with what they said. The whole thing's an analogy for Christian stuff.
Yeah. Well, that was food for me. And then in my 20s, I lived in Nashville, Tennessee. I was in the Christian music business, worked with a guy called Phil Keggy, a wonderful guitarist and sweet man, and was going through a real crisis in my faith. And Phil was going through a big Lewis and Tolkien phase at the time and reading a bunch of those books, and lent me Letters to an American Lady. And then shortly thereafter, I stumbled across Surprised by Joy. And I found that Lewis had thought through his atheism better than I'd ever thought through my Christianity. And so I'm like, well, crap, I got to get to the bottom of this guy. And that was 30 years ago, and I'm still trying to get to the bottom of that guy. And so he kind of led me back into reading, led me back to school. Mostly I went to university in order to kind of be able to understand the allusions and the quotes in Lewis. I did a minor in Latin so that I wouldn't have to look up Lewis's Latin quotes, right? When the scene in That Hideous Strength where Merlin and Ransom are talking.
Just talking, and Lewis doesn't give you it. Pilgrim's Regress does a similar thing too, where we don't,
So minors in medieval studies, that's where all the cool parties were. But I just wanted to understand what Lewis is about. And that's why I did modernist British Lit at Rice. So he really I say that he sparked my imaginative life when I was a child. But when I became a man, he saved my intellectual life and taught me how to think, taught me how to believe intelligently. I mean, the shallowness that I had seen around me and inside me just got blown away by just trying to understand what Lewis would say. So I've been at it ever since. And that's led me into a vocation of teaching, which led to priesthood and led me from No Church, the Baptist Church, Jesus People USA in Chicago, the Presbyterian Church in Nashville, finally came to the Episcopal Church, and have found in the Anglican tradition and the liturgical faith a real home which really kind of values the intellect and imagination and creativity along with solid Christian tradition, scripture, and belief. So I owe Lewis just about as much as one man can owe another, as he would say of George MacDonald.
That's great.
Wow.
Well, continuing, just thinking through your relationship with Lewis, what about these books, these 7 books that we've spent the last few years going through? Do you have a favorite in the Narniad? And if you do have a favorite, now some people it's like picking their favorite child. If you do have a favorite, which of these books is your favorite and why?
Oh my gosh, I'm gonna see if I can reach for one on the shelf. I've got my eBay shelf right over here. Here it is. Generally, when people ask me what my favorite Lewis book in general is, I'll either say Collected Letters Volume 3, Till We Have Faces, for obvious reasons that we'll touch on, I think, a little bit later, or whatever Lewis book I'm reading now. But I think if I had to have one, it would be The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. So those who are just listening in cannot smell or hear. Here's the pages of a British first edition, third impression of The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And
that's one of my favorite covers.
Ah, fantastic. And the map on the inside, right?
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and Reepicheep, the noble Reepicheep, and Lucy, and Edmund, who becomes by the end of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader almost as good as Lucy is. She and Lucy both recognize that Eustace was the dragon, and for Edmund to be granted that kind of vision that was exclusively Lucy's shows the real growth in kind of in his sanctification, to use the theological world. He has changed at his conversion, at his guilt and forgiveness. And much like Eustace in Dawn Treader, Edmund began to be a better boy. And by the time he reaches Voyage of the Dawn Treader, his character really fills out, and he leads like Peter does, and he sees like Lucy does, and he loves, which is, I think, the hallmark of those books. And that kind of loving hand to Eustace. It's the hand that, the Weston refuses in Perelandra.
Exactly,
but,
yes.
But Eustace takes it. And so that's got to be my favorite Narnia. But I love them all. I mean, if you're telling me that I can't have Silver Chair that we did a retreat on a couple of weeks ago in Texas, or I can't have the last battle, the last they had begun, the first page of the last great chapter, I'd fight you. I'd fight you for those. But,
I love your thoughts.
Tonight Voyage.
Yeah, I love your thoughts there about Edmund as well. I was reading through the Voyage of the Dawn Treader with a group of fifth graders. We just finished it actually last week. And as we got to chapters 9 or 10, which is right as they get to the Dufflepuds, the magician's house.
Yeah.
I had a student, and so you've gotten through chapter 8 where you have Edmund and Caspian have kind of fought over Deathwater Island. And I had a student make a comment about, well, Edmund really hasn't done much at all in this book, and he doesn't feel it was somewhat of a critique, but more of an inquisitive critique by this young student. I don't remember the exact words, but it was along the lines of, this feels like a completely different character from the first book, and and the student was thinking about that as if it was a negative thing. And we were talking about this. We were in a Socratic seminar together, and one of the things that came out of this, and that was even revealing to me, I was like, this is why I love doing this, was, it feels like a completely different character if the only character trait we give Edmund in Wardrobe is that he's a traitor.
Yeah.
And we have a tendency as readers and as sinners ourselves to put that only one thing that we see him. But who doesn't see him that way? Well, it's Aslan himself, right? And Aslan doesn't see him only as a traitor.
And Lucy.
Exactly.
Lucy
well said.
Also, she loves him. And the reason Lucy can see is because she loves, but that's a whole nother episode.
Oh, I know. Yeah, I wish we could do it now, but we can't.
Yeah. Well, and remember what he's titled as a king, right? He's King Edmund the Just.
The Just, yes.
What does a justice do? A justice judges, but how often do you hear the justice speaking in the court?
Very rarely.
The justice doesn't until he pronounces judgment at the end, right? And so I think that Edmund has become much more judicious about.
That's well said.
And I think he's learned from, the kind of cruelty that he showed to Lucy. And so, but if you look at how he leads, like Peter leads in Lion, and then how he sees, and then the mercy that he extends, and even the pity to say, you were, just a liar. I was a traitor.
Yes.
Right? I mean, he owns all of that, and he owns that turnaround in his own life. And, whether or not you come from any kind of belief system, this idea that we can be seen at our worst, but do we want to be taken for our worst moments, right? And do we want that to be the only thing that defines it? And so Aslan paid the price for Edmund's, being a perfect little beast, as they call him. But Edmund never forgets that lesson.
No,
and it helps him to lead quietly. It helps him to see piercingly. And then at that crucial moment for Eustace, it helps him to extend him mercy, right? And say, hey, I was worse than you were. And if you notice, the next chapter after the undragoning of Eustace is how the adventures began. So the adventures on the Dawn Treader externally can't begin until they solve that inner conflict. And isn't that true of all of us? We need to kind of grapple with that shadow, dark side, that kind of Narcissan side that we all have. And Eustace does that with the help of Edmund.
That's great.
And I think that's such a beautiful moment. And that change, if you read Silver Chair, in the first chapter, Jill says, "Oh, you've changed," and
she
everybody
recognizes.
can see it,
Yes.
right? And how long have they been in term? They had been back to school for 2 weeks.
And those,
And so the conversion and baptism of Eustace at the beginning of sanctification, that begun to be a better boy, has been so effective in 2 weeks in a high school setting, in a school setting, that everybody can tell. And so I think that a lot of that is kind of midwifed by Edmund's great example.
that's
So,
great.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dawn Treader's so great. But it's not our focus today.
I was
as
going
much
to
as
say,
we
where were you a few years ago?
when we covered the book. Yeah, that's so great.
I was here waiting for you guys to call.
Well, you mentioned Till We Have Faces earlier, and your love and deep knowledge for Till We Have Faces is quite famous. Some people say sometimes it's infamous, but I think it's a very good thing, your obsession with this book. And for our listeners who aren't familiar, tragically, who are not familiar with Lewis's with his final work of fiction, can you just explain? I want to give you the opportunity, if we have time, and maybe we don't, so let me know, why this is his best work, and which book, because he's writing this book alongside Joy within the same decade that he's writing many of these books in the Chronicles.
He publishes Till We Have Faces the same year The Last Battle comes out.
Exactly.
It will come out in 56.
Is there a book you think that also that Till We Have Faces is the most similar to in the Chronicles?
Mm-hmm. All of them. Actually, we'll touch on that in our chapter that we're going to discuss today. There's some very potent moments. I don't want to kind of derail the Narnia conversation because, I would maybe offer in trade for obsession captivation. The Till We Have Faces has captivated me, but the reason it's captivated me is because Lewis made the claim that it was far and away his best book.
That's right.
And in studying it now for almost 2 decades, I can assure you that it's true, and there are profound reasons. I've been working on a critical study of that book for years. Charlie Starr, the wonderful Lewis scholar, always signs his emails to me, "Till we have book," meaning a book from me about Till We Have Faces. Suffice it to say, all of Lewis's other works are at least alluded to, if not quoted, in Till We Have Faces. It's cumulative and culminative for Lewis. But the most important thing that it does is it helps to shift and to correct, I'll even be so bold to say, to correct the kind of focus on Lewis, which is so often about the question of joy. But Lewis, at the end of Surprised by Joy, says joy serves only as a signpost to something other and outer. Mm-hmm. And that phrase, other and outer, is actually a clue. Lewis, in a talk he gave for the Four Loves, says that love is where we go out of ourselves towards the other. So Till We Have Faces helps us to see that everything Lewis is about is love and not joy. And so we'll see some of that in our chapter today.
Oh, that's great.
So I think that if I can do, God willing, can do what I think I can do, I'll help people to kind of re-see not only Lewis and put love at the center of what Lewis is doing all the way along, which I think is true, but hopefully it'll help people to grapple with the idea about the love of God, which I think is the central and foundational, earth-shattering fact of the universe. So that book has helped me kind of focus, even in my own ministry, on what Lewis calls the intolerable complement, that the love of God that kind of makes us tear ourselves open in order to fit all of that belovedness in. And we see some of that in our chapter today.
Oh, that's exciting. That's a great foreshadowing of what's to come. Well, speaking of what's to come, before we dive into this chapter, Andrew, y'all are going through, you're about to start season 7 in the next few months over on Pints with Jack, and y'all are going to be going through his letters. As you already mentioned, you're going through his Letters to an American Lady. You're going through the Latin letters, which is exciting, right?
Yeah.
Letters to children as well. What can other any of our listeners who may not already tune into Pints with Jack, what can they look forward to if they'd like to join y'all? And why his letters? There's a lot of his fiction and nonfiction that y'all have not covered yet.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes people might think, well, the letters just come when you've done everything else. But y'all are choosing to go into that before even getting through the rest of the Ransom trilogy, right?
Sure.
Or some of his other works. What about his extensive correspondence? What does that reveal to us that some of his published works can't or don't reveal to us?
Absolutely. Well, think about it this way. If a long book by Lewis is 250 pages, his published correspondence is 1,300 or 1,800 pages.
Wow.
And so, so that's several books, right? That's 6, 7, 8 books of Lewis's. Lewis answered every letter he received. By the time, he was doing a lot of letter writing, he was famous enough that people were keeping them. And so his letters are this kind of memory trace of his whole life. Mm-hmm. Also, when he's talking about something in a poem and you read a contemporaneous essay and then a contemporaneous, chapter in a book, he's writing all three at the same time, those themes come out in his letters. And so there's also a friendliness. He has a long correspondences with lots and lots of people. He answers every letter he receives in the order he received it as his Christian duty. So he would beg his friends not to write him during holidays. And sometimes he would complain, I've just spent 2 hours pushing pen across paper, the cream of the day gone, and none of my own work done. Mm-hmm. He liked to get up in what he called the small, dewy, cobwebby hours of the morning. But he would consume a lot of his day in this kind of faithful discipleship of loving, humbly, humorously people. He was also very terse, not in tone, but in terms of style. He would really compact the letters. He would answer as quickly and as cogently as possible. So reading through it is kind of a real lesson in style of how to write and get to the point well. And they're just great fun to read. So I would encourage listeners to get whatever you can. There's a great paperback of his letters. The collected letters, the 3 volumes, are kind of hard to track down, especially volume 3. But the others, you can get selections of Lewis's letters, and invariably, when I open up a volume, a couple hours go by, and I'm like, oh, wait, what happened? Because they're very compelling to read, and there's this great kind of humble, good humor in them. So wonderful, wonderful reading.
It really stands out to me that Lewis considered responding to those letters his duty, but he did not consider it to be the work that he wanted to do, but it ended up being published work just like everything else.
Yes.
And so many more people benefited, not just that one person. He wasn't just helping that one person anymore.
Plus, I'm a chronology guy along with Joel Heck. And I'm sure that his Chronologically Lewis on joelheck.com. An invaluable resource, 1,200 page PDF of every single date that Joel can track down in Lewis's life. And so for me, kind of understanding what Lewis is saying demands a context. Where is he? What's he doing? Kind of what's going on in his life is very helpful. And so the letters provide a whole memory trace, right? Because if you can date an event, and that's how I changed Lewis's conversion date in Early Prose Joy. In Surprised by Joy, he said he was converted to theism in Trinity Term 1929. But in Early Prose Joy, he said in the year and the month that he learned to dive is when it happened. And we now know that he learned to dive in June of 1930. So that changes the date. And I've had talks with Alistair McGrath about some of this stuff.
Interesting.
So the letters are just an invaluable kind of memory trace in addition to their own literary characteristics and just the good, sheer, rollicking fun.
That's great.
Well, that's on my list now.
I'm excited to dive into Letters to an American Lady. I got an edition. This is you've inspired me a little bit. This is I don't believe it's a first edition.
Yeah.
But
open up. Let me see the front flap.
let's see.
Does it say book club selection at the bottom of the desk
A
jack?
family bookshelf selection.
Yep. Yeah.
So this.
Yeah. So not a true first, but looks exactly like the true
Exactly,
first.
yes. So
Yeah.
not a true first edition, but still looks like it, and you've inspired me to maybe stay away. Not that they're inherently bad, but I've been staying away from some of the Barnes & Noble kind of trade paperback editions of some of his books, and looking for some of the much more beautiful ones that are a little bit harder to find, but that you can find on eBay or other places, even your own eBay page, which we'll link down in this episode.
And that one is Letters to Lyndon B. Johnson's wife. Is that?
That's not what that's not the American Lady.
No. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Major and the Missionary. Warren Lewis's brother, had a long correspondence with an American missionary doctor, Blanche Biggs. And unusually, we have both sides of that correspondence. And the marvelous C.S. Lewis scholar, Diana Glyer, and you should throw a link to her work up there. She has published on the Rabbit Room Press, Andrew Peterson's outfit, and Pete Peterson. She's published all this correspondence between Warren Lewis and Blanche Biggs, which started after Lewis died. And so, jokingly, Diana said, "Well, it looks like Warren Lewis also had his own American Lady." And there's some really just beautiful reading in there too. So,
Well, that's great.
yeah.
Let's go ahead now and transition into chapter 13. I think listeners have a good sense of your relationship to Lewis, and if they aren't already familiar with you, they understand how you're approaching this text. And with that in mind, let's dive into one of the very last chapters in the Chronicles of Narnia, a chapter that in many ways is a huge turning point for the rest of this book. And Phil, I know you actually haven't read what comes next, so some of this might be significantly more confusing to you. But
It's okay because we're so close.
You're so close to the end. Exactly. But with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and read the chapter summary for chapter 13, and then we will dive into all that is happening here. So here is chapter 13.
And by the way, Daniel, that's a great approach simply because Bruce Edwards of blessed memory, a wonderful Lewis scholar, died a few years back. When all the Narnias came out, the movies started coming out, and people were asking about allegories. And of course, they're not allegories. They are supposals. Lewis said, let's suppose there was a world like this. How would things work out? But Bruce said, read the lines before you read between the lines.
Exactly.
And I think that's a great approach. So yeah, carry on.
All right. Well, here's chapter 13. Tyrion and the 7 friends of Narnia feast upon beautiful fruit that they find nearby in this mysterious place. Peter explains that some of them were whisked away into Narnia from the train platform, while Lucy shares that a similar thing happened to those friends inside the train. Tyrion is surprised to learn that he entered this world through a door that appears to come out of the ground. He learns from Lucy, who is interrupted regularly by Eustace, that the Narnians, the Calormans, and the Dwarves have entered through this stable door as well. The group of dwarves astoundingly do not appear to realize where they are. Despite the beauty of this open world before them, the dwarves believe they are inside a disgusting stable. Nothing is able to convince them otherwise. Aslan himself finally appears to the friends, and he explains that there is nothing he can do to reveal the truth to them.
Well done.
I'd love to turn to you really quickly, Phil, and because Andrew and I are familiar with this chapter and with the rest of this book, I think many of our listeners just need to know what is going on in your head right now.
Yeah, this was a really interesting chapter because for the first time I felt like we were starting to get answers, but then when I finished the chapter, I felt that I wasn't 100% sure. On top of that, I mentioned something that happens in this chapter specifically to SJ, and I found out she had a reaction that made me question whether or not I actually understood it. So I'm really curious about the train part.
Okay.
and how much. I'm not sure where they are. I'm really not sure how the door works, and I'm not. It's hard to know. Is this an analogy? Is this a supposal? Which things line up with the stuff that we know about, or the stuff that we've read about in the Bible? Um, and I thought I was so close to having more answers, but now there are a few more chapters, and I'm not sure if we're gonna get a few more explanations or what. And I'm not even sure that y'all can tell me right now. But I really did enjoy this chapter, and I prepared for this 20, 29, 30 hours ago, and I'm glad that I waited as long as I did because I've been really excited to talk about this and to dive a little bit deeper.
Sure. Well, thanks for sharing that. One of the things that interest me, and Andrew, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well too, is one of the very first things that happens is, and I think our listeners or readers of Lewis's books who are familiar with their Bibles or just familiar with the Christian story itself, we get to this very interesting place that feels like somewhat of an in-between place between Narnia and maybe Aslan's country. It's not quite clear at this point what's going on. And one of the first things that all of these children, or these what were children, all see, these 7 friends of Narnia, is this beautiful fruit, which Lewis explains is so beautiful. It's better than the freshest grapefruit or the juiciest orange or the most melting pear, right? It makes all of those things look bad in comparison. But right before these characters go and eat this fruit, there's a little bit of a fear of, should we be doing this? Right? We can think about back to Genesis chapter 3. We can probably also think back to Magician's Nephew, right? And Peter has, the High King has this great line where he says, "It's all right. I know what we're all thinking, but I'm quite sure we needn't. I have a feeling we've got to the country where everything is allowed." And then the children take and they eat of this fruit, and they haven't done anything wrong. There's no guilt involved. There's no permission even needed. How interesting that that's where we start.
Well, and you'd also, I think you would, if you've read Lewis's science fiction books, I think that you would rightly kind of hear at least an echo of Perelandra.
Oh, absolutely.
Where Weston, and that's an unfallen world. It's a world where there is a sinful human, but there is no sin in the world, and no fallenness. And so he eats this marvelous fruit. And even that fruit, I think, pales in comparison to this. And the narrator says, "I can't describe it," which echoes what Paul says about the third heaven, right? You can't find out what it is like unless you get to that country and taste it for yourself. And that certainly, I think, has echoes of what happens in the Great Divorce, right? You shall eat such apples, right? If you are, if you go further up and further in, right? Instead of trying to pick up the apple, the golden apple that the ghost tries to do. And so I think you have some hints about where this place might be.
What's interesting too, and I think this is the right time to maybe discuss it, even though it doesn't come up till later, is, if you're reading this, and we know that there has something to do here with Aslan's country, and so Phil, we're not giving you too much information here, but the idea is, well, if Aslan's country was was an actual allegory of heaven, for instance. Well, one of the things that's interesting is that we see both all kinds of people here. Later on, we'll see the dwarves. We know that at least one Calorman, 2 Calormans, because Emeth's there as well too. But the first Calorman comes in. We know that Ginger the cat comes in as well, and even Tash was there. And on top of that, even one of our characters, Eustace, is constantly interrupting and kind of getting on people's nerves. And so one of the questions I had thought at first was, well, is there sin here? How does this work? If this is an allegory, if this is supposed to be Aslan's country, there wouldn't be sin, or would there? And then I came, like you did, Andrew, I thought back to Perelandra and thought, well, there's a difference in Perelandra. Venus is not heaven. it's unfallen, even though there is a sinner. And so
Right.
what we see here in this space that we are currently in this chapter is quite a similar thing, where it in some ways appears to feel, or be maybe even, unfallen, but there is absolutely sinners here.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly that. Lewis had some interesting comments on purgatory, and the gist of what he said about purgatory is, I think that God would be only just polite to allow us, coming as dirty as we are in our traveling clothes from this world into the next, wouldn't he give us a little antechamber to, to put on nice clothes and get freshened up, right? The barest hospitality from the meanest guest would allow you to do at least that. And so I think that there may be some of this. There's also a clue. Edmund had a rather sore knee from a hack at rugby, and suddenly it's gone. Right?
Exactly.
And then remember what happened to old King Caspian when he died and went through the river. He turned into this kind of vibrant young man, golden bearded and all the rest. And so I think that we have some clues about what might happen. And we do certainly know in The Great Divorce, in Lewis's fictive world, people who will consign themselves to hell can have vacations in heaven. He talks about that in the preface to Great Divorce. And so without giving anything away, except knowing how it ends, that I think that there are clues that this may be heaven, even if there are sinners who are interloping there for a moment.
That's well said. Just to go back for a second, and I know this is slightly veering a little off topic, but I think it's helpful because we have you here on the show to help us think through this. Lewis, I believe those quotes from him on purgatory, is that in Letters to Malcolm that he says that?
I can't remember. That's when I need David to look things up for me and send me a text a couple days later.
It's interesting because, and I know for a fact that also purgatory comes up for him in some of his collected letters. I can't remember exactly, but we see that side of Lewis, who takes something like purgatory, which he does.
And let me clarify. I mean, Lewis is a Reformed Protestant. He's Church of England, Church of Ireland all his life. He's not suggesting the kind of purgatory that the 39 Articles decry.
Say yes.
And so this is just an idea of maybe as part of our transformation, or maybe when we stand before the bema seat and the wood, hay, and stubble is burned up. Maybe this is that moment, and that's what other traditions may call purgatory. So this is not Lewis endorsing a traditional doctrine of purgatory, just to be clear.
Yeah, I think is it Article 12, I think, in the 39 Articles, that's it talks about like the Romish doctrine of purgatory. The way it's written is just incredibly it's very clear. It's very, very Protestant.
It's reformational.
Would it be safe to say that Lewis's views are more, he is thinking more about the idea of purgation and not a particular place of purgatory? Or is that something we can't necessarily tell? And I'm not talking about right here in Last Battle, but in general with his own theological views.
Yeah, and here's where I think Lewis is very much an amateur theologian. So I'm not sure. I think that that's an interesting question. I would love to hear it kicked around the Inklings. Remember that Lewis says, I think in Problem of Pain, that a hell for humans and a heaven for mosquitoes could be quite easily combined, right? I wonder if, in my off moments, not thinking all that theologically, so please no letters, but sometimes I wonder if heaven and hell might be geographically in the same place, because in heaven I want anybody but me. I want the other. I want Christ, and I want all of humanity. I want to love others. And in hell, I only want myself. And so can you imagine how hellish it would feel to be surrounded by people who are constantly giving themselves away and taking no thought of themselves? So yeah, my theology professor probably wouldn't approve.
but it still makes a great thought there too. And I think some of that comes up, Phil. I mean, are you I assume as we're reading through this and you hear Polly and Diggory say things like, we didn't feel old anymore, you have to be figuring things out of like, wait a second, this can't quite be, this has to be something beyond.
Yes, definitely. This whole conversation made me feel much more sane and smarter. But I did think I thought they had died, and I thought that they were in a new place, and I thought that place was Aslan's country, which would be the equivalent of heaven. And then I was confused by each detail that came after that. The fact that they saw or thought they would see their parents on the train, or that their parents would be on the train, that threw me for a loop momentarily, because I was confused if maybe their parents had died because they're older now and their parents were coming to pick them up. My mind went to a few weird places. But then it was the sentry being there, and I couldn't tell, is he inside the door, or are they able to see him right outside the door? Because they're looking through the door. The illustration helped a lot that they were peering through the door. But at first I thought they were looking sideways through the door. I was all over the place. It was really the fact that the sentry was there, and I wasn't sure, how does someone get into this place if this is, quote, heaven, the equivalent of heaven, and that sentry wasn't necessarily supposed to be there. But it makes a little bit more sense, especially when Andrew pointed out the people can visit, or it can be a temporary thing. And a lot of these are just preconceived notions of what heaven is, which is informed by some pretty odd stuff, like a lot of cartoons growing up. You get a little halo, and you float around.
Yeah, and a harp and all the rest. Well, and at the end of the chapter, when you see that the dwarfs refuse to be taken in, and they don't have eyes to see, and this is very much like Orwell, who will not allow herself to see that Psyche is really dressed in finery and living in a palace.
Yeah, the palace is really there. It
absolutely is there. And this is, David pointed this out, but it's been a cornerstone to some of my interpretation of Till We Have Faces. So kudos to David. Orwell doesn't see the palace until she gets on her knees. Until her body assumes the position of prayer and humility. Until her body puts her in the position of selflessness. That's when she's granted vision. But until then, she refuses the invitation to joy. It's not long before that the voice of love, the God of love, says to her, "Why should your heart not dance?" And she refuses that invitation. And I think that this is a really good answer to those who may not believe in hell, or may be universalists. I think that there's a real heaven, and I think that there are people who will not let themselves be taken into heaven. And it's not that God is refusing heaven. Heaven was created for humans. Hell was created for the devil and his angels. And as Lewis says in The Problem of Pain, the gates of hell are indeed locked, but they're locked from the inside.
Exactly.
Right? And so the dwarves could allow themselves in. And would they like it when they got there? And if they wouldn't like it, what sort of people would they be? Lewis in Mere Christianity talks about the practice of virtue. The development of virtue is to become the kind of people that would be at home in a place where everything was good. But if you're selfish and you're only looking for your own kind or your own self, you would be absolutely miserable in a place where people are looking beyond themselves. And so it's not that God will keep anybody out of heaven. God will thrust heaven on anyone who will sit still for it. It's people who, when they see that they have to give up something, like Pam, right, in Great Divorce. Oh, if I can't have Michael, I'm leaving. And she would take her son from heaven to hell so that he would be with her. That's not love. That is the opposite of being a loving mother.
Exactly.
Right? And her selfishness is kind of one of the pass keys into hell. And that's what you see is I think Lewis is picturing a God who would bring anybody into heaven, who would, and trying to woo and convince and use everything in his power to create this place, or to offer this place to anyone who will open their eyes to it. But if people will close their eyes and resist his will, like he says in Great Divorce, there are two kinds of people: those who say to God, thy will be done, which is all of our Narnian friends here, and those to whom God says, well, thy will be done, because he's not going to break our will. He's not going to force us into heaven if we refuse it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very different picture of God than the one that I initially had as a kid. And when I realized that, it really helped me understand the love and the provision and the grace of God, who will woo, trick, do anything to get people to give up their grasping clutch on themselves in order to receive the fruit and the love and the peace and the lack of fear and all the goodness that awaits us in Aslan's country.
That both of those examples you give from the Great Divorce I had here in my notes as well too.
Sorry.
No. This is great. And as you're saying that, I was reminded actually when I first came across the very, very famous quote, the one you just mentioned, that there's two kinds of people: those who say to God, "Thy will be done," and those to whom God says, "Thy will be done." Right? I remember reading that and not fully comprehending it. I probably read it in high school or a bit ago. And it wasn't until, and I want to say it's about 2/3, 3/4 of the way through the book where you come across the mother. And I got to this scene. We've come across other people at this point in that book. And what was so intriguing about this, and for listeners who don't know, there's a mother who has this kind of very controlling, very possessive love over her son, right? And what's interesting about her as a character is I think for everyone, readers and other characters alike in the book, it's entirely clear that she is being possessive and selfish. But from her perspective, what she is doing is love. Now, it's not love, obviously, but she seemingly thinks that it is love. And
it's love, but it's not love for Michael, it's self-love.
Exactly.
And that's the only thing that we cannot take it with us into heaven.
And it's in that moment, for myself as a reader, that I understood, in the end, God refuses to break her will. And an episode or two ago, Phil and I were talking about, I was going through the problem of pain, and I got to near the beginning of divine omnipotence, where Lewis talks about God having rules that he has to follow, right? And I think sometimes for us in the Christian tradition, I think maybe I mentioned this in the episode, so maybe our listeners have heard this before, but I think sometimes we let our view of God we often let our view of God or our theology be far too often dictated by what looks nice on a coffee mug, right? Through all things are possible through God, right?
Right.
And so,
Live, laugh, love.
Or that one too. And so we say, well, God can break any rule, and there's nothing that God can't do. And Lewis' argument here, and we hear it even from Aslan, is he even says there are things that I can do and things that I cannot do, right? I cannot show these people. He even does a low growl near the end of the chapter where, and we can get into this in a little bit, where the dwarves think that it must be some kind of machine, right, that's making this noise. And Aslan is so clear. He's like, I will show you what I can and what I cannot do. And what's so interesting is I think Lewis does such a great job, and I wonder if this is because he's an amateur theologian, of making that much more palatable and for laypersons like myself, right? To say, that's what it means. It's not that God is simply saying, well, all right, if you don't choose me, then I'm going to just take my ball and play. Because I think when I was a high school and I read that passage in The Great Divorce, I thought it meant, well, if I can't have you, then I'm just going to take my ball and I'm going to leave the playground and fine, you can go have it, almost like out of spite, right? And that's not what God's doing.
Yeah, one of the analogies I've been using around this topic lately, and I don't have children, but I've been a sibling, and I have lots of friends who are parents. When your kids fight, and your parents make the child's, okay, you guys knock that off and now say I'm sorry and shake hands. And then they say the impossible and mean it. Well, they can make us fake it, and they can make us shake hands, and they can make us mutter the words. But unless my heart has changed, I am not going to mean it, right? And so God is effectively saying, I can't make you mean it. And if you refuse to soften your heart, right? If you refuse to soften your heart to me and harden your heart to your own, nastiness, I can't make you do it any more than a parent can make their kids really forgive each other. Now, you hope that before 20 minutes or 2 years are gone, they, get over the offense and they love each other again. But in that moment, you can't force them to, it's the great theologian Bonnie Raitt, right? I can't make you love me if you don't. And here are the dwarfs. I can't make your heart feel something it won't. And the dwarfs won't be taken in. And you got to get the Latin sense of that, of the word. Volo, like voluntary, is to willfully do something. Volo means I will. Nolo is the Latin word for I will not, like I am willing not to do that. It is my will that this not happen. It's, by the way, where we get that great phrase, willy-nilly. It's
really?
Volo or nolo, right? Yeah. And so the dwarves are nolo dwarves. They're nolo, 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 nolo. I will not, I will not, I will not. And eventually God's going to say, okay, your choice. I wish you would make another choice, but I won't reach inside you and turn you into a robot so that you will march automatically into heaven. He won't do that to us. And so he's honoring the choice of the will, which is this dangerous gift that he gives us. He wants us to turn it to himself. He wants us to feel sorry and to reconcile. But there's only so much he can do.
What's interesting in the dwarves, and really that's kind of the crux of this entire chapter, it's even what the chapter is titled, is the way in which Lewis, as this conversation we're having, he paints the dwarves as, refusing to be taken in. And that's something that could stand for all time. This idea of, refusing to will yourself or willing yourself not to. But then there's also this other approach Lewis has, which is that he paints the dwarves in a very modern, kind of borderline into postmodernist depiction here. And Joseph Pierce had a great quote that I came across where he said, "The knowledge we gain through our physical senses is meant to lead us into a deeper metaphysical truth." And he made the connection, which became very obvious to me after I'd read his own connection, right? It always works this way. Oh, how did I not see this at first? Where the dwarves are given opportunities to embrace the truth through every one of their 5 senses. So there's the sound of Aslan growling. There is the sight. There's the darkness, but they refuse to see. There's the feast, the taste they're given. At one point, Tyrion grabs one of the doors, I think it's Diggle, right, and throws him, and he feels like he's gone up against a wall. And then there's the flower that Lucy gives him that he believes smells like manure, right? So all of their senses, there is something presented to them to say, here is the deeper metaphysical truth of your reality. And they refuse to see it. And Lewis does this exact same thing in chapter 14 of Dawn Treader, to go back all the way to the beginning of this episode, where Coriocan says, it's Edmund who says, "Golly gee, he's a retired star." And Eustace very famously says, well, in our star, or in our world, a star is just a giant flaming ball of gas. And Coriocan reminds us that sun, in your world, that's not what it is, simply what it is made out of.
That's not all that it is.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. And so there's this deeper metaphysical layer beneath that very basic Platonic ideal. And I think this comes out as well in the dwarf's response here, to Aslan growling. Here's what they say. I want to read it because it's so interesting. "Hear that, That's the gang at the other end of the stable, trying to frighten us. They do it with a machine of some kind. Don't take any notice. They won't take us, in italics, in again. And it's that line, they do it with a machine of some kind, right? This idea that, well, those previous beliefs, well, they were some kind of, as Lewis might even jokingly say tongue-in-cheek, they were a medieval superstition, right? They're using some kind of modern machinery. And whether it be, as he called with Freud, the new look, right, as he talked about kind of Freudian psychology, or whether it be with actual industrializing civilization, that there's this kind of machinery that almost it's both able for us to make sense of a post kind of a post-Enlightenment world where all of those beautiful metaphysical things were just, like we said, medieval superstition. And machines can answer all of the questions that we used to think that only metaphysics could answer. No. All those things that were once otherworldly, they were once supernatural. No, they can be answered with some kind of modern explanation.
And so let's do a little etymology. I just looked this up. So machine is a very interesting word. And yes, while there is all of that modernization and urbanization, and Lewis and Tolkien despised the car factory that was being put into Oxford, machine comes from Middle French, which means a device or a contrivance. So it may have that very modern sense of machine, but it's also a device or a contrivance. They're making it up somehow. So a machine gets assigned to this thing where we can't explain how they did that thing. So let's carry both of those senses, but it also, your literature students will know the deus ex machina, right? The God and the machine, right? Like in Shakespeare's time, they would, lower a god from a machine or something like that. Right. So I think that there's that where they're saying, hey, there's somebody behind the curtain. They are trying to contrive, right? They are trying to pull one over on us. In addition, and the mechanical sense I think is good too. It reminds me so much of Susan, and what you were talking about just there really is pulling a couple of things together for me. And I promise not to footnote you in my book because I won't remember, but it's going in there. Susan, when asked, the name of Aslan is spoken for the first time, each of the four children has a numinous reaction, a reaction to something that is holy and other and large, right? Peter feels strong and brave, and Edmund feels a mysterious horror. Susan feels as if a lovely smell or a strain of music had passed by her. And I think that phrase "passed by" is signal, because Susan kind of doesn't get it. And we won't spoil anything for Phil, but Susan doesn't get it. But when we will not hear the appeal to mind or to imagination or to heart, God will stoop to appeal to the body. And that's the parable, right, of maybe I'll send my son. And so it's the body that he has to stoop as low. It's a completely kenotic, it's a kenosis moment, an emptying out to assume a body, even the death on the cross. It's very bodily as the last resort. Susan is appealed to sensually because she thinks the rest of the stuff is made up. But it's the rest of the stuff that's actually real. And now that you mentioned that the dwarves have all five senses appealed to, now I've got to go back and look at Orwell, because I am sure that all five senses are appealed to, and that she ignores it. And so that's going in the book, and I'm not giving you credit, but I'm giving you credit tonight.
Well, that's my credit is I'm reading Joseph Pierce as well too. So
well, and to Joseph Pierce, who's a dear friend and an amazing scholar. But I think that he'll appeal sometimes to the body as a last resort.
I think that's well said.
And remember Susan's reaction. The dwarfs think that Aslan's voice is a machine. Susan thinks that the risen Aslan is a ghost.
Oh, that's right.
He is the very opposite of a ghost, right? He is fully bodied and intends our good, and
is not dead.
Is altogether there and is not dead. right? He's the opposite of a ghost. And I think that Susan also perhaps they appeal to the bodily because nothing else will answer her imagination. But we see what happens with the man with the lizard. When I abandon the bodily, God slays it so that it can rise again, so that I can ride it like a horse and surpass all others. And so the body, brother ass, St. Francis would call it, can be a potent gift. But I think it's one of the last resorts of Aslan's appeals to us. That's so good.
And in that appeal as well too, we mentioned a few episodes ago, and Andrew, when we were talking before we hit record here, I mentioned that I am in this interesting season where I have gone back and back and back again to talking about bicycles, which is this essay that Lewis published in October of '46, and in this, which I won't get into it again because I think it was just 2 or 3 episodes ago, right, that we mentioned this film. And in that, Lewis, though, leads his readers in this kind of to dialogue. It feels actually very much like a Platonic dialogue where you have these two characters speaking back and forth. And Lewis, though, hilariously has himself as kind of the one who's not understanding, and this other man is the one speaking to him. And he goes through these 4 stages of enchantment where he talks about the enchantment in the bicycle of being unenchanted, then being enchanted, then being disenchanted, and then being re-enchanted. And I keep going back to this over and over again because the dwarves are stuck in being in this disenchanted stage. But what's interesting, and what's unique and different about being unenchanted versus being disenchanted is that those who are disenchanted once knew that they were enchanted. So the truth of what occurs during enchantment is still known to them. They are not ignorant of that truth. Those who are unenchanted are ignorant. Those who are disenchanted know the truth, but have decided that that truth cannot be real, or they have rejected it. And in my personal life, in my work life, I mostly work with students who are right on the cusp of becoming disenchanted. They might only be 3 or 4 years away from it. And so I spend most of my time with children who are enchanted. And what is so intriguing to me, and I don't have all the answers here, and maybe as we keep talking about this, some of this will start to make more and more sense to me. But in order for us to become re-enchanted, if we have hope for Susan, because we did, Phil, we learned about her no longer being a friend of Narnia. If there is hope for her,
I lost hope at that point, but now that Andrew has hinted at something else, I have a little more hope. I don't know if that's coming.
Well, and I think some of that hope, Andrew, y'all will come across this in Letters to Children, because her name appears in some of those letters written after Last Battle is published.
Yeah.
And Lewis kind of is very coy about it. He doesn't give much information, but I think...
But he makes a purgatorial affirmation, right?
Exactly.
After Narnia ends, he says, and I don't want to give it away for poor Phil, but he says, well, I still believe that there's hope for Susan.
Exactly.
Right? And that's even after the apparent story is done, there's still a space. And in the same way, Orwell comes to the end of her book, literally to the last words. Long did I hate you, long did I fear you, I might. And she writes words and obscures them with her head. She comes to the end of her story. I know what the words are that Lewis never revealed. I know the words that she wrote, but what she wrote is the beginning of our story. And you see that, and again, don't want to spoil anything, but you'll see that idea that the end is the beginning. You see it in Harry Potter, but part of the reason that you see it in Harry Potter is because Joe Rowling says, I can't walk through a room with a book by C.S. Lewis and not stop and pick it up. Right? And so at the end of things, it's the very beginning. You certainly see that in The Great Divorce. Right?
And just to go back and finish this thought
Yeah,
about...
sorry.
No, you're fine. This is great. To finish this thought about re-enchantment, I think what the dwarves, they seem to be embarrassed and contemptible when it comes whenever they reflect on the fact that they were once enchanted. How could we have fallen for something? We refuse to be taken in. And there's this presupposition there that they were taken in and they're embarrassed that they had once been taken in. And I think that so much of reenchantment, which Lewis talks about, has to be with acknowledging, and he speaks about it in the essay, that the mirage was real. What you did feel, even if it wasn't actually completely true, was pointing towards truth. One of the things that in talking about bicycles mentions is the man speaking about when he first became enchanted, said he found that the bicycle was almost the secret to life. Well, that is silly. The bicycle is not the secret to life. But that feeling that this might unlock something so much deeper, that level of enchantment, that is the numinous, right? And that is when we want to re-enchant ourselves or children, right, or even adults, right? It's acknowledging that what occurred during enchantment was not something to be embarrassed by. And I think Lewis actually says this quite well. I was recently reading his review of The Hobbit, and at the very end of that, he says this, and I'll read it here. He says this as he's this was published actually on my birthday in 1937, October 2nd, 1937. This is his final paragraph.
So old.
Yeah, exactly, yes. This is his final paragraph in his review of The Hobbit. For it must be understood that this is a children's book only in the sense that the first of many readings can be undertaken in the nursery. Alice in Wonderland is read gravely by children with laughter by grown-ups. The Hobbit, on the other hand, will be funnier to its youngest readers, and only years later, at a 10th or a 20th reading, will they begin to realize what deft scholarship and profound reflection have gone to make everything in it so ripe, so friendly, and in its own way so true. Prediction is dangerous, but The Hobbit may well prove to be a classic.
Yeah.
And I do think that it's and Lewis and Tolkien, this is what, is somewhat of the impetus of why they want to write children's literature, is because they're so frustrated with literary criticism around children's literature that something like Alice, The Hobbit, these Narnia books, you shouldn't think back to them when you're an adult and say, oh, I can't believe I fell for that. I see that sometimes where even my own students who are starting to get that, oh, I can't believe I liked that book back in second grade. Well, let's talk about that. That doesn't mean that book was perfect, but something there drew you in. And that can be the hindrance into re-enchantment, and that's what the dwarves don't get.
Yes. Well, and again, at the risk of spilling all of the magic beans, there's that moment that we'll get in a chapter or two where Susan kind of mocks them for wanting to get together to talk about Narnia. And she's interested in much more pragmatic things. And that's very nearly at the last chapter of the last battle. But I marvel at the way that it circles back. And I've spoken about this before. It circles back to the very dedication to the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And the problem with the dwarfs, and the problem with Susan, and the problem with the gleefully disenchanted is that they are not yet old enough in Tinadril's sense, in the Lady of Perelandra's sense. Oh, I am older, right? They are not yet old enough. Susan isn't old enough to start reading fairy tales again. She's not old enough to appreciate that the Narnia stories were more real than any of the other things in her life. I mean, poor Susan, she's Clarissa Dalloway, right? She's standing at the stair with all of her party and her flowers to get. And she's all concerned with these things, but it's the other things that are far more important. And she's on the cusp of that. I had a letter from a student not long ago. He was a student in my C.S. Lewis class when I taught high school. And we got along great. And then the second half of the year, I also had to teach his English class, and that didn't go so well. I didn't know what I was doing. I was taking over for a teacher that left. And he kind of got disenchanted, I think, with me. As well as high school. And I didn't hear from him for years. A friend requested him after graduation, didn't hear from him. And I just got a note from him in the last couple of months. And he said, hey, I've changed from engineering. I'm now going to be a teacher. I had to write an assignment about a teacher who I admired and respected, who influenced me. Here's that 2-page essay that I wrote about you.
Oh,
And
wow.
Wow.
he said, I'm sorry that I just needed to close the door on all of that time in high school, which I thought was a brilliant phrase. And I wrote back and I said, it's a really difficult era, a really difficult time in a person's life to try to become human.
Mm-hmm.
Those teenage years with the upper cortex is barely waking up and all the rest of it. Of course, it had a wonderful reconciliation with him. Don't blame him at all. It's hard. And he wasn't old enough to start reading fairy tales again, right? He wasn't old enough for re-enchantment. And I think that one of the grave warnings, but the delightful promises of this chapter is that it's fine to be unenchanted and disenchanted, but it's not fine to stay there. And there's something much, much better further up and further in, isn't there?
That's great.
Similar with I don't think there's anything wrong with, quote, deconstructing your faith. In some cases, your faith might need to be deconstructed because it was not properly constructed. But
Right.
the problem I see is when people stop there. And I've talked to enough people at this point. One of my good friends, who is very, very strong in his faith now, had a very dark time where there was a lot of questioning and a lot of doubt. And I didn't know them during that time, but I see where they are now, and I'm amazed that they even had that time of doubt. But they emerged from it so much stronger, and it gives me so much hope for. I have people on. I play Ultimate on the weekends, and I have several people on my team, and one by one, they all started sharing how they grew up in the church, and they were sharing very negative things that they did not care for. They did not like that, quote, Halloween had been boycotted. They were, everybody was going around
Don't
saying,
visit my house next week. We got to get my son's Spider-Man costume.
they were going around saying all these negative things. And at first it makes me incredibly sad because I can't help but view that as a permanent perspective. But having talked to so many people and hearing stories like this, where there's this time of disenchantment, but then a time of reenchantment is possible, it gives me so much hope for, of course, these people that are only in their early 20s or even early 30s, their story hopefully isn't done yet.
Well, and I just got back from clergy conference as a priest in the Episcopal Diocese of Central Florida, and we invited a couple of authors from the Orlando area, which is where I live. They just wrote a great book called The Great Dechurching, and looking at the phenomenon of the 40 million people who are now considered dechurched. They've got great statistics. They did a ton of research. It's really, it's very well done, and it's starting to make some noise in lots of different places. And he said, of the 40 million, 8 million or 20% are, well, he says out of the 40 million, 30 million are casually dechurched, and 10 million are casualties, right? And so most of the people who have dechurched are not breaking down their faith and vowing never to return and all the rest. Some of them were never really Christians. So if you ask them about the Nicene Creed, the 8 million of the 40 would only 1% would say that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. But almost all the rest of those who have been dechurched, some of them have a very high orthodoxy scale. 98% of one group. And mostly what they want is a nudge to come back to church. Now, that's not a panacea, and I'm running quickly over deep research. But I think that one of the things that happens when we deconstruct faith is we deconstruct our false image of what we or others projected faith to be.
Right.
Which is why I wasn't troubled by the Philip Pullman books, his Dark Materials, like Amber Spyglass and all that, is because the church that Philip Pullman can't wait to ridicule is a church that I don't believe in either.
Yeah.
What he portrays as the church is not the church like Screwtape says, as we see it as a great army with its banners unfurled. And what Pullman is trying to tear down is exactly the same thing I'm trying to tear down in the pulpit and in the parish every week. And if they let go of their false notions or their inherited notions of what they thought being in faith is, and they meet the not tame, wild but good lion. And I have a friend who deconstructed very publicly on social media and ex-evangelical this and all kinds of explorations of sexuality and all the rest. And I spoke to them recently, and they're in classes to become Roman Catholic.
Wow.
They're not going back to the evangelical church of their upbringing, but they are marching as steadily as they can towards true, authentic, historical faith. And so I think that if we see that arc of enchanted, unenchanted, disenchanted, re-enchanted, if we see it as an arc and we see it from Aslan's perspective at the far end saying there is no other stream, come through, keep going. All right. And Lewis, I think in Mere Christianity says if somebody a half-hearted Christian stops going to church, that's often a move closer towards truth than farther away. So, and you certainly see some of that here with the Dwarfs.
Absolutely. Oh, this is great. This is really great.
Well, I want to keep reading lots of books and talking about these books so that I can connect that many different things that succinctly. That was impressive.
I'm a lot older than you, brother.
Well, the very end of the chapter here, Aslan does actually appear as we move away from the dwarves, and as we already mentioned,
time.
He says, this is the first we've seen of him in this book, and all the children who have this long relationship with him, the children and Diggory and Polly as well, who we've been told are actually younger, or at least appear to be younger than they were before they arrived. They kind of bury their hands in his fur, and they hug him. And Tyrion, who has never met Aslan before, kneels before him, and Aslan, pretty much says, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Right? He doesn't use those exact words, but he tells him, "You've done well here." And he does explain to us that he's not able to do everything for the dwarves. We do have him, growl or make that low, dull roar. And then we get left here on a cliffhanger because he does bring a feast for the dwarves. We've mentioned this, where, there's this beautiful feast laid out, and they kind of think that everything they must be eating would be whatever they find in a stable. They even though it's not by their senses good food or drink, they still fight over it, despite the fact that they think they're eating hay or all kinds of weird things. And when they all kind of come back to it, Aslan makes it clear. He says, as I mentioned earlier, he says, "They will not let us help them. They have chosen cunning instead of belief. Their prison is only in their minds, yet they are in that prison, and so afraid of being taken in that they cannot be taken out."
Yeah.
And that's pretty much where the chapter ends. He does turn around and say, time, and now it is time, but it ends, and you don't really know what that means yet. So, But Andrew does this.
But if we have read our silver chair, remember.
I was going to say, Andrew especially knows because he just came from a silver chair conference. So he's got that right in the forefront of his mind. And you're looking at us like you were very confused right now.
Yeah, I can't wait to re-listen to this in a couple years and nod along with all of our listeners.
Well, before we pass on to that, I just noticed something. So I'm so grateful that you invited me on today, because I've never noticed this before. And of course, I'm now seeing things far more sacramentally in my new work as a priest. So each of the dwarfs, let's see. Aslan raised his head, shook his mane. Instantly, a glorious feast appeared on the dwarf's knees. And each dwarf had a goblet of good wine in his right hand. That's what I do on Sundays, is I raise a goblet of good wine in my right hand and say to the congregation, "This is my blood. Drink this, all of you. This is my blood. This is the blood of the new covenant, shed for you and for many. Do this for the remembrance of me." He's making a Eucharistic invitation. He's giving them a goblet of wine, and we know what that stands for. We've got the whole Galahad and the Grail thing, but the Grail thing goes back to the cup at the Last Supper. And then they raised golden goblets of rich red wine to their lips, and they said, "Ugh, fancy drinking dirty water out of a trough that a donkey's been at." That's an incarnational invitation as well, because that's looking at the manger. It's the trough where the donkeys ate. And it's dirty because here he is taking on this human flesh. And it's water. It's the water of life in this, disguise. Malcolm Guite says, we see you now disguised as everything. So even their description of it has this echo of incarnation that even the Narnians won't know because we don't know Aslan's story. But we on this side of the wardrobe door know that the dirty water in the trough is in some ways a symbol of Christ.
Absolutely.
Of the Christ child. Right? And even that, he's like, how much more of me can I force down your throats?
Yes.
People say, oh, God, I don't want you to shove religion down your throats. God's doing as much as he can. Aslan's doing as much as he can to get them to taste and see that the Lord is good. But they just refuse.
This is so great, that sacramental imagery there. I mean, the mere fact they're sitting here, they're holding, this symbol of the blood, right?
Right.
And they
right.
just...
And Orwell and Psyche holds out a goblet of wine, and Orwell thinks that it is water, right?
Yes.
And her blindness has done the reverse of the first miracle, right? She has turned wine into
water. Exactly.
Which I never noticed until now. So thank you again. No footnotes. Sorry.
It's, one of the things that I have found too is Lewis has littered so much of his chronicles with sacramental imagery. We just got to, and we've mentioned this on the show, I was with my students, we got to the very end of Dawn Treader, and I love that. I think it's Doris Myers who kind of helped in C.S. Lewis in Context walk through that idea that, no, the Lord's Supper is not occurring at Aslan's table. It can't be. There's no presence of Aslan there.
Right.
How could that be the Eucharist? Instead, the Lord's Supper, the sacramental imagery given to that, the Eucharist in the Dawn Treader, is when the Lamb is there and they share a meal together with the Christ. And that, and Lewis...
It's the marriage feast of the Lamb.
Exactly. Lewis consistently uses this sacramental imagery to consistently show us the truths, really in a way that I think makes it most palatable. And he has that great line, I don't have it in front of me, where he says, when he's describing the Eucharist, it was actually when I've tried to explain the idea of a sacrament to someone who maybe is not as familiar with it, I've used his quote, and I don't have it directly in front of me, where he says, there's no place where the veil is so thin between us and God. That's the way that Lewis, it might be in a letter, he writes that, or in maybe like letters to Malcolm or something, but that's here.
And then he also says, apart from the Blessed Sacrament, the holiest thing presented to your senses is your neighbor.
Yeah, and that's weight of glory, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But which is not the quote that you're talking about.
No,
but
exactly.
That's another place where he's elevating the sacrament.
Yes, and it's... how much more could Aslan give? He can't. And that's, I think, what's so interesting about this idea that Aslan has to follow rules. He literally cannot give more than himself. You're no longer being logical or rational. It's impossible to give more than yourself. The dwarves have all of him, and they still reject it.
If he had to break people to make them follow him, he would never have given us good or free will to begin with. Mm-hmm. Let me also add a note to people not familiar with the liturgical tradition, because that wasn't my tradition growing up. I was a nothing growing up, and I'm an Episcopabapticostitarian. But it took me a long time, and I'm not an ex-anything. I'm not a former Baptist. I'm not a recovering Presbyterian. I embrace all of those traditions. But a friend of mine, a graduate of Wheaton College, had a professor there, not a Catholic, but he said every Protestant, every evangelical who is not a Catholic should know perfectly why, and should consider carefully the Catholic Church. Just by sheer numbers and sheer courtesy, it pays every Christian to understand the liturgical and sacramental nature of Christian worship. Because for 1,500 years, we were all Catholic, if we weren't Orthodox. And more Christians alive today are liturgical Christians than any other brand combined, right? 1.3 million Catholics in the
Yes.
world today, and add in all the Lutherans and the Episcopalians and any of the other kind of liturgical Methodists and stuff. These potent symbols of Eucharist, of bread and wine, of of the sacraments, these are part of our Christian heritage. And I'm not encouraging anybody to change churches, but I'm encouraging careful Christian readers to steep themselves in the symbolism and the understanding of the sacraments, just so we can be literate culturally, religiously, and literarily. Right.
I think that invitation, Andrew, is a great place for us to end this chapter. That invitation, because what you're inviting people into is a sacramental further up and further in.
Sure.
Right? For those who are, and even for those of us who are in more liturgical traditions, there's always to go further up and further in. There's no stopping. It's not, there's no, it's continually going. And Phil, again, you don't know what further up and further in means. Sorry. But
3 more chapters.
If you know the Great Divorce, he says it in the Great Divorce too.
That's very true. But any final thoughts, Andrew, that you'd like to share with us before we just take a quick look ahead and to the next chapter and then wrap up?
I'll just, taking a cue from what you just said and what we were just talking about, I think the liturgy and the sacrament, the Eucharist, is important. But part of the thing for me as a priest is now not only do I get to make the sacrament, I get to consecrate the host, but I also do it every week. And I do it 4 times a week, 5 times a week often. And so this meal is kind of like the meal at the end of Ramandu's Island, right?
Every morning.
And
right?
it's a new meal, and the mercies of God, the steadfast love is new every morning. And no matter what time of day your listeners are listening in, the steadfast love of God is new every morning, and it's always morning somewhere, right?
Very true.
It is never not time to partake of that feast of mercy and asking forgiveness and receiving that food. And there's this kind of, and those meals, the pandemic couldn't stop Holy Eucharist, couldn't stop the sacrament. And those meals will continue until we find ourselves with a goblet of rich red wine in our hand and a feast upon our knees. And God hates the day when that comes. But until then, we'll enjoy the feast of each other's fellowship and these good books and all the other good things that God gives us.
Amen. Amen. Well said. Any final thoughts, Phil?
I'm excited to wrap this book up.
Yeah.
Just not only to understand what further up and further in.
Yeah, further up and further in. That's right.
It's all starting to.
I believe you're not next chapter, and this is a great segue for us because next time we're together, we'll be at chapter 14, Night Falls on Narnia. And this was originally...
Night with an N.
What was that?
It's night with an N, not a K.
Yeah, not a nightfall. It's Night Falls, not Knight.
Night, yeah.
Yes, this was actually one of the original titles for the book that Lewis toyed around with for a little bit. In this chapter, Phil, Aslan brings an end to Narnia.
Oh.
And this next chapter we're going to read, which you can go home and read tonight, Aslan
might
will
have to,
bring
actually.
an end to Narnia.
And after we go off air, I'll tell them why this next chapter unlocks a key moment until we have faces. But listeners will have to
They'll have to wait till the next time you're on and we get to just talk about till we have faces together. Well, Andrew, thank you so incredibly much for being on the show today, for having this wonderful conversation. It's great to both geek out about Lewis, but then also talk about the things that Lewis points us to, those transcendent gospel truths that are at the heart of all that Lewis is doing and why we're so thankful for him. It's not, yes, it is him and his work, but it's ultimately because who he is pointing us to. And you've done such a great job leading us there today. Thank you for that.
Very
well. And I may just suggest, I hadn't thought about this before. Maybe it's geeking in.
I love it. Yes.
We're peeling back the onion and getting into the real truth. It's just an immense honor to be asked to come on, and thank you, listeners, for the honor. there's lots of choices in podcasts, and for the honor of you taking some time out of your day to listen to us, explore, play around with these treasures. Thank you for the time, and I pray that it's a blessing to you and a joy, as much as it's been a joy to share time with Daniel and Phil.
Yeah, we're thrilled you're here. Very quickly before you go, I want to share with everyone an Andrew Lazo story. So what was the service that we all went to when we were in South Carolina?
It was at St. Philip's Church, I believe. We got to go to a Holy Eucharist church.
Yep.
Or Holy Eucharist service,
Yep.
which actually had the Archbishop of the Anglican Church in North America, Archbishop Foley Beach, which I had never, maybe you have before. I have never been in a service with an archbishop before. I've been in services with bishops, but that was a very special, it was a very beautiful service, had a full-on, not only a choir, but they had some horns and some other instruments. Very beautiful and wonderful.
And the silver they used for the service was actually given by King George III.
Yes,
to that church.
It was
before the Revolution.
It was given to the church, I believe, in the 40s or something. But the meal that I remember going up to the front to receive the Eucharist, and they're giving it out on these plates. And I went back later and read, and I was like, oh my goodness, these are plates that actually were given by the King of England. How interesting and cool!
With a note.
In my heart of hearts, I said, "Thanks for lunch. Sorry about Yorktown."
Yeah, I was gonna say
we're Virginians, so we love that. Yeah,
it had an old English note on it saying that if you do choose to no longer be a part of this country, then I would like these back. And we apparently never gave them back. So what I wanted to share was the music was incredible, and the venue was incredible. I think it enhanced the music. There are horns. There's a chorus. Beautiful service, but at the end of every song, Andrew would turn to me, and I wish this was a video podcast because I could make the facial expression, but he just exhaled. He would puff his cheeks and exhale and go and look at me. We were both blown away by the music, and I think that level of appreciation is something that comes through when you talk about Lewis's work and when you talk about the work that Lewis was also reading and engaging with. And we're really glad that you joined us today.
Well, thank you. I think that sometimes as an evangelical, I got lost in the true to the expense of the good and the beautiful. But I think that experience shared with you, and certainly reading Lewis, especially in the Narnias and elsewhere, is the good and the true and the beautiful all piled together on the page, just waiting for us to turn it and to dive right in.
Right.
Well said. Well, Phil, will you wrap us up today?
I sure will. This episode is made possible by our patrons over at patreon.com. If you'd like to support the show, you can listen to a bonus episode each month, along with other rewards. Special thanks goes to John Marr, Emily Wakefield, Ryan Smith, Ashlyn Washburn, and Andrew Trophy for supporting us at our top tiers. And real quick, I just want to point out, I just sent out all the stickers.
You did? You sent out all the stickers?
By the time this episode comes out, they will definitely have
all the season 7 stickers to the patrons and support us at that level as well too. And I also just say that all the links to Andrew's work and to Pints with Jack will all be in the episode's description as well too. So if you have enjoyed this conversation and don't already listen to Pints with Jack or haven't been following Andrew, you can find a lot more of his work down in the episode's description right now.
Right. And then I'll do a shortened version of this, but email us at thenarniapodcast@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 406-646-6733. And you can also check out lamppostlistener, all one word.com. To find out about other guests on the show, other books that we've read, and notes from the show. Thanks for coming along on this journey. We'll be back next time for Chapter 14.